everybody, and welcome to Jessica. We're really happy you're here. Jessica is a wildlife biologist in the San Luis Obispo area and currently works for Althaus and Mead, Inc. In Paso Robles. And she does hikes and things like leads hikes in the San Luis Obispo area. Sounds wonderful to me right now, all the time. And before that, she was a biologist for Big Sur Ornithology Lab in Big Sur, and that sounds exciting. Studying songbirds, that's amazing. So dream job, right? Studying anything to do with birds, it's wonderful. And you do a lot of things with Kern Audubon Society, which I also really like. That's awesome. So I want to welcome you. I want to also remind everybody, if you want to go ahead and turn your video off, I'm going to turn mine off just so we can save bandwidth and make sure everybody's muted. And welcome, Jessica. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I'm very happy to be here, very happy to be presenting to Kern Audubon Society. And so, gosh, without further ado, let me go ahead and share my screen. Okay, so I'm going to talk about why birds flock. And this time of year, fall and winter, we start seeing lots of birds grouping together in these flocks. And you might wonder, how come birds form these flocks, and why don't all birds do that? I will say, when I was choosing titles for this talk, one alternate title was What the Flock, but I went with the less controversial Why Birds Flock. So, okay. So flocking is a really unique phenomenon, and flocks can actually be sort of huge and dramatic, like this flock of starlings. They can be loud and annoying, like a flock of crows. Or they can be beautiful and mysterious, like a flock of geese flying in front of the moon. And flocking birds have long really captured our imagination.
No.
But why do birds actually do it? And let's learn a little bit more about sort of the science behind flocking. Oh, and somebody's, can you guys all just make sure to mute yourself? There we go, perfect. Okay, thanks. Okay, so let's start with basics. Why do birds flock? Well, it really comes down to a cost-benefit analysis. So the benefits of flocking, you've got cooperative foraging. So that means when birds are foraging together, they can actually find food faster and help each other find food. They can also participate in information sharing, and that means that they can communicate with each other about the location of food or the location of predators. And speaking of predators, there's also safety in numbers. So it's much safer to be in a large group. It's a lot less likely for any individual bird to be targeted by a predator when they're in a flock. Now, there are some costs, of course. And one of those, the flip side of it being easier to find food when you're in a big group, is that then there's increased competition for that food. There also is a higher risk of disease. You know, you can see this photo of shorebirds here. These birds are not observing social distancing. And so there is an increased likelihood for spread of diseases or other illnesses, you know, in a large group like that. And as well as the risk of increased aggression. When you've actually got a lot of animals together in close quarters, you're more likely to have negative interactions between them. And so that can increase the stress level of any individual member of the flock. So that's also a cost. Now, when it comes down to it, really, it's all about the accounting. So do the costs outweigh the benefits? And if they do, then the birds will form a flock. So in today's talk, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the main reasons why birds actually do flock together. And I've focused in on sort of three big areas. And there are other reasons that birds do flock together, but these are kind of the three I would like to focus on. So first we have migration, foraging, and safety. And we actually already touched a little bit on foraging and safety in the cost benefit section, but we're really going to go in depth on that. I actually do want to pause really quickly and say, I do want to apologize, sidebar, if my internet connection goes out or is a little wonky. Been having a little trouble with it, so hopefully it's not too bad. I'm just going to push on. Hopefully I won't get kicked off Zoom. Okay, so first, let's talk about migration. So when most people think of flocks, when you ask somebody to picture a flock of birds, the most likely thing you're going to think of kind of right away is that very traditional sort of V-shaped flock of ducks or geese flying. So large birds are generally the ones that actually migrate together, and those are large birds like waterfowl, geese, ducks, cranes, swans. These birds are heavy and they need extra lift. So it's really all about energetics. The V formation actually generates lift for the birds behind the wingtips. So the bird in the front is doing the most work, and the birds behind are basically riding the draft or the wake of that bird. Much like when you get a bunch of cyclists in a pack, like in the Tour de France, you get those cyclists are riding each other's draft. Well, migrating birds, these large birds, are doing the exact same thing. And that leader is really doing most of the work. But of course, that bird would get tired out very quickly. So those birds do swap positions and they switch around and take turns being the leader. And research has actually shown that the birds are actually saving, those birds in the back that are riding those wakes are saving up to 40% of their energy. So we're talking really significant amounts of energy saved just by flying in that V formation. And I want to talk a little bit about a research project that really studied those energetics. So let's talk about northern bald ibises. Now, this is a face only a mother could love, but they're a very interesting bird. And these researchers conducted a study examining exactly how large-bodied birds derive benefits from flying in a flock formation. So every single bird was actually fitted with a GPS backpack. The researchers actually raised the birds as juveniles. So they went and got eggs, they got all the proper permits and everything, and they raised the birds. And the reason they raised them is so that they could train them not only to wear the backpacks with the GPS transmitter, but also to follow a light plane and to follow that plane in formation. That allowed the researchers to know exactly when the birds were going to fly, how long they were flying, all of that good stuff. And the GPS backpack that they were wearing was measuring not only their location, the latitude and longitude, but it also had this inertial measurement device. And what that means is it could tell the position in space that the bird was. It could also tell when the bird was flapping its wings, because the bird's body goes up and down as it flaps, and the little device could measure that as well. And the speed of the bird, all kinds of really cool data was in this backpack. And so here is a picture of an ibis getting a GPS transmitter and that inertial measurement device strapped to it. And it doesn't hurt them at all. It's temporary. The researchers can take them on and off. So the birds were totally comfortable wearing those. Okay, the next slide, hopefully it works, is video that the researchers shot. Let's see if we can get this to play. So this is filmed from the plane, and it's just, there's no sound, but it's video showing all the ibises flying in formation. And in the closest one, you can just barely see the GPS backpack on that bird. So very fun. So those are all the birds wearing all their equipment. So let's talk results. What did the researchers find? Oops, hang on a second. We got to make sure this actually goes to the next slide. There we go. Now, this looks a little bit crazy, but it's not too confusing when you start looking at it. So every one of these shapes is the data that came from one bird in the flock. So there are 14 birds, and this is a little heat map showing the amount of time that a bird spent in position in the flock. So the crescent shape here, that's the shape of the flock. So you can see that some birds spent their time moving all over, but some birds, like this bird right here, these one in the middle, second from the top, actually preferred to be on the left side of the flock. So they do move around quite a lot, but they're constantly sort of changing position. There's no one, really dominant leader. It's very interesting. And what the researchers learned is that the birds actually change their wing beats depending on their position in the flock. So when they're flying in a staggered position, where they're not all lined up behind each other, the birds will sync their wing beats with the bird in front. And that maximizes the capture of this upwash, this current. And when the bird changes position and is flying directly behind the leader, then they will actually get their wing beats out of sync, and that avoids. Hang on, there we go. Okay, sorry, looks like I got temporarily muted there, but we're all good. Okay. So just really fascinating to see how these birds really they're doing a lot. They're not just flapping information, they're also doing kind of pretty advanced energetics analysis. Okay, next slide. Oops, I skipped one. Nope, there we go. Got it. Okay, sorry. Okay, so the next time you see birds flying in a V formation, you'll actually know how much work they're doing in order to save energy. So it's pretty neat. Okay, let's switch gears and talk about flocks and foraging. So one of the most important reasons to join a flock is to improve foraging success. So foraging efficiency increases in a flock because the birds they watch their flock mates. Hang on, sorry, forgot to mute my cell phone. They can watch the birds the other birds in the flock, and they can actually learn the locations of hidden food items. So if one sees that another bird is having a lot of success looking under bark and getting stuff, then that bird will start doing that too. So they can learn from each other and the best way to forage. Every individual bird can also spend less time watching for predators. There's many more eyes to look out, and they can take turns looking out. And the prey that is flushed by one bird can be grabbed by another. So this is a picture of ground hornbills in Africa, and they walk together. It's almost like beating the bush. So the bird in front, those birds in front will stir up ground prey, insects and small lizards and things like that, and they will go for them, grab, but they will miss a few, and the birds behind will reap that benefit. They can get the prey items that the birds in front mix. So it works to everybody's benefit. Another great example of cooperative hunting is in white pelicans. So where I live in San Luis Obispo, near the coast, there's a lake called Oso Flaco, and on this lake we have white pelicans, and it's really fun to observe them. And actually I've seen them too in the Central Valley. You guys might have seen them. They will actually do sort of the humpback whale style scoop together, where they form a giant ring, they open their bills, and then they all swim to the center, and they essentially trap all these little fish together and then can scoop them up. So this cooperative hunting is much more effective with a whole bunch of birds in a flock than just one. And I really love this picture because you can see that cormorant has positioned itself right in the center. The best spot to be getting free fish. He's really figured out how to make the system work for him. Okay. So up until now, I've actually been talking about flocks composed of just one species of birds. And of course, everybody's heard birds of a feather flock together. And that's rooted in the observation that large flocks of birds tend to be comprised of a single species. However, I'm sure you guys as birders have observed this. There are lots of times where birds of different species do flock together. It's actually pretty common, and they're often referred to as mixed species foraging flocks. And that name tells you sort of why the birds are together. So these are flocks comprised of multiple species that are working to find food together. They forage together to maximize those benefits, and they're also led by what we actually call a nuclear species. That bird, that species will attract other birds to the flock, and they actually act as the leaders of the flock. Now, nuclear species is a little bit of a funny term. And when I actually Googled nuclear bird, this is the kind of thing that came up. The internet is a very weird place. I am not talking about mutated, crazy monster radiation birds. Instead, nuclear as in the nucleus of an atom. So think about the nucleus is at the center and the other parts of the atom orbit around that. So nuclear species are very gregarious. They're highly social and they readily form flocks. They tend to display conspicuous plumage coloration, so they tend to have really easy to recognize markings. They're also year-round residents, so these are birds that are non-migratory. They do not leave the area, they're there all year round, and they know the area very, very well. And they have to have a well-developed alarm call so that other birds, when they hear that species alarm call, they will know that something is wrong. And in San Luis Obispo on the Central Coast, and actually kind of throughout the Central Coast, up in Monterey, Big Sur, and down the coast as well, our primary nuclear species is the chestnut-backed chickadee. And these birds are a permanent year-round resident. They have those bold facial markings. The black and white is really easy to recognize. They have very loud, recognizable calls, and they have alarm calls for all different kinds of things. So they have different alarm calls for ground-based predators, for people, for aerial predators. So they have a big alarm call vocabulary. And they readily form at the end of the breeding season. In late summer and early fall, they will form flocks together. So they meet all the requirements of a nuclear species. So in Central California, mixed species foraging flocks are really common, and they are actually really throughout California, they are too. And so if you think about this, migrating birds, millions, billions of birds are migrating through every fall. And these birds are passing through the area. Many of them are young birds that are migrating for the first time and have no idea what they're doing. So they are very often unfamiliar with the habitat they are stopping in. So if you go to a new town, how do you find food in an unfamiliar place? Okay, now I used to ask this question at talks, and up until nowadays, is you look on your cell phone and you Yelp. Okay, imagine before cell phones. Before cell phones, how would you find the best place to eat in a new town? You would ask a local, okay? And that's actually exactly what these migrating birds are doing. So it's very beneficial for those migrants to join these flocks led by local resident birds or nuclear species, because those birds know where the food is. They know what kind of food is in the area. They know where the water is. They know what kind of predators are around and how to look for them and when and where the predators might be. Whereas a bird who's brand new to the area might have a lot of trouble really figuring out all those different things. So in Central California, our local mixed species foraging flock participants, remember the flock is being led by those chestnut-backed chickadees. So this is just sort of a little montage of birds you might see with chickadees in those flocks. Wilson's warbler, yellow warbler, Pacific slope flycatcher, downy woodpecker, warbling vireo, Townsend's warbler. The list goes on. I personally have seen mixed species foraging flocks of like 15 different species. So, and every good birder knows too, especially in the fall, if you want to find a rare or unique warbler, finding one of these mixed species foraging flocks is a great place to start, because very often you will get these vagrants or these migrating birds really joining up with these flocks. So you never know what might be in a mixed species foraging flock. Okay, so I've spent some time talking about our local mixed species foraging flocks, but this is a phenomenon that happens all around the world. So in Central and South America, species that flock together actually have matching color patterns. These multi-species flocks are so important that birds, those species that flock together most oftenly, have actually evolved matching colors. It's really cool. And there's a couple of possible functions. So those colors could be like a badge that actually increases acceptance by flock members. So those other birds kind of know, oh yeah, you belong with us. You're going to forage with us. You're not going to be competition. It could also be a uniform that aids in recognition of sort of friendly flock species. I hesitate to use the word gang colors. That's not really right. I think that's personally hilarious. But anyway, it's really a badge or a uniform that aids in recognition. And so I'm going to actually go through a couple of geographic regions that have these different colors. And what's really cool is that the birds in different geographic areas have different flock colors. So for instance, here we have birds that flock together in the mountains of Western Panama. So here are 6 species, all of which have black and yellow. So that's their uniform, is black and yellow. So some really fun, and you can see the black and the yellow is, you know, it's not, they don't all look the same, but all have those colors. And these are all birds that forage together regularly. In the South Central Andes, the flock colors are blue and chestnut. So here we have 6 birds who flock together and forage together very frequently, and they all have this same color scheme. Now these guys are actually a lot more similar. They're mostly chestnut underneath and sort of a blue or gray on top. So this really is more like a uniform than those birds in Panama. So just really fascinating. And there are actually quite a few different examples of this in Latin America, Central America, and South America. So a really common strategy. Okay, I'm actually now going to switch gears, and last but definitely not least, I want to talk about one of the most important reasons that birds flock together, and that is for protection. So this photo right here, this is a photo of a peregrine falcon stooping on a flock of European starlings. And this photo was actually taken in the Central Valley. And the photographer, you can see on the bottom, his name is Nick Dunlop, and he took a ton of really cool photos. So his photos are going to kind of feature throughout the rest of my presentation. But first, let's talk about why and how birds flock for safety. So when we think about it, one of the more obvious reasons that birds might flock together is increased chances of spotting a predator. Again, you've got just tons more eyes on the lookout. So the odds of any individual spotting a predator are higher. More birds in the flock, as I said, more lookouts. And this is really important, per bird, they can spend more time foraging and less time being vigilant. So it's all about that time budget. They're spending more time on getting food, which is very important, and less time having to stop and look around when you've got lots of birds who are all looking at the same time. And an added benefit is that alarm calls warn all birds in the area. So if a flock spots a predator, they'll give an alarm call, and all the birds in the area can be made aware of that. So it's really just beneficial for everybody. Vigilance is another really important key part of being in a flock. For example, ostriches must keep an eye out for lions. And at any given time, you've got basically one bird playing lookout while the others can forage. So that's what we see in this picture. You can see the bird kind of in the center there. Its head is keeping lookout while all the other birds can put their heads down to the ground to forage. So really important. And I love this, but can you guys think of a California bird species that often conspicuously posts lookout for the rest of the flock? At least in our area, that's California quail. So California quail are a great model for this sort of vigilance behavior. They will take turn watching for the flock. So one bird will be sitting up high on a branch or a post, keeping watch while the rest of the flock is foraging. And they can all take turns. If you watch long enough, you'll see that eventually that bird will go back down to the ground, another bird will take its place. And that allows them to spend more time foraging. There we go, there's our flock on the ground being looked over by our sentinel there. Okay, so if a predator gives chase, there's a lower chance of an individual being caught. The flock will initiate these evasive maneuvers, and it's a lot harder for a predator to pick out a single target in a flock, especially the bigger the flock is, the harder it is to choose a target. And birds that get separated from the flock are therefore more likely to be eaten. And so you actually have this selection pressure working on the birds to really incentivize them to stay with the flock, because anybody that gets too far separated might get picked off. Here's another picture by Nick Dunlop showing a peregrine falcon going after some starlings. You can see the starlings have just formed this tight ball. I would, if I was that peregrine, I would find it extremely difficult to pick out a single starling to go after. And here's just, I've got a few more photos just because these pictures are so cool. You can see this is a massive flock of starlings, and you can see there sort of just to the left, main column there, that sort of darker speck, that's the falcon coming in. You can see the birds have bunched together at that point. So just really phenomenal to watch this. And again, here's another really cool picture showing all those starlings moving together to evade that peregrine falcon on the edge there. So seeing these photos, you might wonder, like I did, which is how on earth do the birds do this without running into each other? How do they know how to turn? How can they do that? And this has been a question that people have really wondered about. I mean, as long as there's been flocking birds, particularly flocking starlings in Europe, people have really wondered this, and it really was a mystery. And I got to tell you, there were a lot of very entertaining hypotheses about how this might happen. So some of the theories included natural telepathy, thought transference, some sort of biological radio that they all tuned into, or even disembodied electromagnetic consciousness. So we really basically had no idea how the birds were doing this. I personally love the idea that, well, all birds must be psychic, and that is how they can do it. Turns out that's not the case. Okay, so I'm actually going to talk to you guys briefly about some really cool research that basically answered the question of how do those starlings move like that. So these Italian researchers filmed flocks. They filmed starling flocks in Rome. There was just huge flocks that would come in near one of the big train stations in Rome. And so what they did is they got 3 high-speed cameras, and they filmed the flocks from all different angles, and they essentially built a 3D model of all the birds. Then they used really sophisticated tracking software for analysis. And what they discovered is that each individual bird in a flock is actually keep track of about 6 to 7 birds around them in the flock. And instead of copying, just looking at the direction that a neighbor bird is going, what they're actually doing is copying how sharply that bird turns. So they're not even really paying attention necessarily to direction. It's more just following the turn and the sharpness of the turn. And basically the message to turn will start from a few birds on one side, usually the birds that are closest to the predator, and it actually sweeps through the flock 20 to 40 meters per second, which is 90 miles an hour. What that means is for a flock of 400 birds, it takes them about half a second to turn. And the researchers, I actually did look at the paper that the researchers published, and it is wall-to-wall equations because they had to use some really crazy math to kind of figure this out. It actually turns out that the way they describe the movement of the birds is they just give them spin, which if anybody has done any reading about, I don't know, particle physics, that's how they will actually describe atoms and electrons get spin. Let's just say, long story short, the math is pretty complicated, and it turns out that the equations they use to describe these flocks of birds are almost identical to the equations that describe the movement of supercooled or liquid helium. So we really had to wait for math and technology to get sufficiently advanced to where we could really figure out how these birds were doing that. So really phenomenal. And that is how you can get these truly remarkable flock formations. I love this picture. I mean, look, it's a rabbit. Okay, so I want to sort of end my presentation on, I've shown you lots of still photos of birds flocking, but I would like to show you guys just a brief 1 to 2 minute video clip of starlings in action. And I want you guys, not only, of course, to marvel at the beauty of these flock formations, but to really think about how the birds are actually doing that. So they are, you know, following each neighbor so closely, following the angle at which they turn. You can watch and see how when the flock starts to turn, how the, you know, kind of that message or the information about turning kind of spreads through the flock, and different parts of the flock are reacting to sort of different things. So the different pieces of the flock might not be going the same direction, but they're all moving together. And I also want you to look, it's a little hard to see in the video, but a red-tailed hawk actually comes in at one point and kind of starts circling, and you can see the birds, the starlings, come back to that. Okay, so without further ado, I am going to see if I can get this to work. You'll just bear with me as I share the right screen. Okay. Actually, let me just do this. Okay. Okay, I practiced this so I would get it right. Okay, here we go. And okay, and so I think we're gonna go ahead and wrap it up and leave it with that. So that brings me to the end of my talk, and I will take questions. Okay, oh, I need to look in the chat. Okay, so I'm going to look in the chat, and if anybody has any questions, go ahead and type them into the chat, and I will answer them. Okay, so Harry asks, I noticed that when it comes to shorebirds, the smaller the bird, the larger the flock. Is this true for other birds? You know what? That's actually a really great observation. And that actually does, it's not always true, because think about winter in the Central Valley, and you get, you know, flocks of snow geese in, I mean, how many thousands and tons of that. But generally, when you've got a flock as a unit, particularly if you've got a birds migrating or sort of a social flock, that is true that the larger bodied birds, when you've got migrating geese, ducks, cranes, etc., it's not as many individuals as you have for these smaller birds. And that's really, I believe that's a function of safety. So those little guys, they need more protection because they're more vulnerable to predators. And so the bigger their flock, the better. The safer they are, the again, the more vigilant the flock as a whole can be, the less time each individual bird can spend looking for predators. So that's a great observation. And let's see. Oh, can you share the URL or other identifier for your family video? Yes, I can. Let me see if I can figure out how to do that. What is the best way to do that? I could put it into the chat. Will that work? I don't know. I'm not sure what the best way to do that is, but I'll just type it here. I'll put it into the actual chat. So the title of the video is Starling Murmuration 2020. And it's by a photographer who I believe is Dutch. And the starlings were filmed, I believe, in the Netherlands or possibly Germany, but he's the one who filmed that. So the video is from that filmographer. Okay, we got another question. Any example of a cowbird or other parasite or predator mimicking the gang colors? That is such a good question. And you know what? I have not heard of that. However, I would actually not be surprised, particularly in the tropics. You have such a huge diversity of birds. And what I would see is, I don't know too much about the different taxa of birds down there, like who's a nest parasite. However, I could totally see like a freeloader species coming in, maybe somebody who is not going to participate in vigilance or who's just there to sort of like steal or sneak other birds' food. I can definitely see that happening. Okay, question. How do our wildfires and or smoke affect migration? That is also a really excellent question. And you know what? I don't think that there's actually a good answer for that, because we've only been getting these really like mega fires in the last few years. We do know that migrating birds tend to migrate relatively high. They're not super duper high, but they tend to be quite a ways off the ground, you know, several hundred to maybe, 1,000 feet off the ground. They tend to migrate at night, and they use and follow prevailing winds. So that said, if you've got a really giant fire with, that smoke is also going to follow the prevailing winds. It could totally have an impact, but it's not very well studied right now, so we don't really know. Birds also are very capable of altering their routes and altering their timing in order to be safe. So for instance, if the winds are blowing the wrong direction or the weather is bad, they will not try to migrate. So if there is some sort of obstacle or hurdle, they may possibly choose to try and wait it out. Whether or not that might have an impact on them, sort of down the road remains to be seen. But, we could, so basically just don't know. Okay. And yeah, do we have any other, I don't see any other questions in the chat. And so Harry, I see that you unmuted. Do we want to go to people unmuting themselves to ask questions?
If some people feel uncomfortable or not sure how to use the chat, they can unmute themselves and maybe pose a question. I'm not sure, but if anybody has any question, unmute yourself and ask it right now, Jessica.
All ears if you guys have any more questions.
Okay. Well, on behalf of our members, I want to thank you, Jessica, for a very informative program tonight. I enjoyed it the second time, and I think that we all had a good opportunity. I know, maybe I'll ask a question right now. The starlings are the ones that are the most informative as you watch them. Are there any others that also produce patterns like that you know of besides starlings?
Yeah, so starlings are definitely the most well-known because they make these sort of, first they form like massive flocks and they, do these kind of crazy maneuvers. But actually shorebirds do some really, they don't do the same sort of undulations, but if you have ever seen a flock of shorebirds moving around when a peregrine comes on the scene, I can tell you it's actually remarkably, they will form like this tight flock and will fly really low to the water, and they do these crazy zigs and zags and like swirls. So shorebirds actually do some really similar maneuvers where they're just all tightly following the same sort of crazy path. I've seen it a couple times actually. I saw it one time when I was way up north in Humboldt at, it was either it might have been the Arcata Marsh way up there. And there were just hundreds, maybe thousands of shorebirds, and a peregrine came in, and it was crazy. So yes, other species can definitely do it.
They do that, okay.
I've seen blackbirds do the same thing. Next door, living blackbird.
Oh, I'm sorry, David, I can't quite hear you.
Red-winged blackbirds.
Red-winged blackbirds, yes, absolutely. Actually, blackbirds, that's a great observation. So I have seen blackbirds form quite large flocks, and I have never personally witnessed a flock of blackbirds have to take evasive maneuvers, but they definitely could. If they're small enough that they're for sure could be prey to another species. Oh, I've also seen actually swallows, and I've seen cliff swallows. If you guys have ever been to, a cliff swallow colony, they will, if they're ever disturbed, they will all sort of pour out of their nests. And I saw one time it was a gray fox was trotting along, and the swallows came pouring out, and they just sort of made this like tornado and they were all giving arm call and swirling around and kind of like swirling down. They weren't exactly dive bombing the fox, but they were kind of swooping down to let the fox know like that they saw it and they were very aware of it. So that was a pretty fantastic phenomenon to witness. Oh, okay, we're getting some more questions in the chat. Okay, for the larger birds like geese, is there a negative effect with regards to energetics if there are too many geese in the flock? Has anybody quantified the maximum number of birds in a flock before an energetic maximum is reached? That is an extremely good question. To my knowledge, I do not believe that that's a good question about whether there's sort of diminishing returns, like the bigger the flock, the farther back you go are the benefits less and less. And I actually don't know that. It's totally possible that somebody has quantified that and I just don't know. But it is interesting. I had always thought that the size of a flock of geese or sort of large-bodied birds like that might be limited more by resources. So if you've got 100 geese all migrating together and then they land at a spot, a geese can eat a lot. They're a big bird. And so you might have the limiting size for a flock may be more on the sort of foraging efficiency end than the energetics end. However, that said, it seems like a totally plausible theory that you could get, diminishing returns basically for those, the farther out on the ends of the V that you are, but a very good question. Okay, I think, oh, lots of thank yous. You guys are very welcome. Any other questions? Okay, that might be it. Oh, Harry, you're still muted though. You guys are very welcome.